Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Hashing the Atom Day 2. This is the Session 3, Threats and Risks in International Commerce Using DLT to Prevent WMD Proliferation. I'm Rick Cupitt, Senior Fellow and Director of the Partnerships and Proliferation Prevention Program. And I'm privileged to be joined by three excellent panelists today. We've got Tony Bliss, who's a program analyst with the FBI and their Chemical Biological Countermeasures Unit. We've got my good colleague, Cindy Vestergaard, Senior Fellow and Director of the Blockchain and Practice Program, as well as the Nuclear Safeguards Program. And a good friend, Andrea Visky, who's a non-resident fellow at the Stimson Center, but she's also the founder and director of the Strategic Trade Research Institute. You can see all their bios in the webpage for the announcement. I'm happy to put that in the chat if, or Joshua might be able to put that in the chat if you want to see their fuller bios. But I thought we might just get right to it. So I'm going to go in order as it was in the web announcement. So we'll do Tony first, and then Cindy, and then Andrea. Each presentation will be no more than 15 minutes, and we're going to give a very short space for one or two immediate questions if there are any from the audience. Please put your questions in your YouTube chat function. So then we'll have presentation, some opportunity for one or two immediate questions, and after the end of the three presentations, then that should give us about 30 minutes for question and answer. Again, you just put your questions in your YouTube chat, and we'll get passed on to me, and we'll make sure we'll do our best to answer as many of them as we can. On that note, I think we'll just jump straight to Tony. So over to you, Tony.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Appreciate it. Hopefully everybody can see the screen there. But just to recap, my name is Tony Bliss from the FBI Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate, the Chemical Biological Countermeasures Unit. My apologies for not being able to share video. The capabilities of sharing video, FBI headquarters is very limited, so we're not able to do that today. But in true FBI headquarters fashion, trust that I am still wearing a suit and shirt and tie for everybody out there. So I did still dress up for this event either way. So just a quick background about the unit. We're kind of a unique unit section, actually, focusing on chem, bio, rad, nuke. Specifically, I focus on the chem threat, but what we do is we work with intelligence analysts, and we try to identify some threats that we may not have the capabilities or current ways of identifying or mitigating. So we get to sort of come up with programs and work with partners and people and design solutions and talk to people and create tripwires to help mitigate the threats and identify bad actors. What I'm about to present on the Common Threat Information Exchange, we're really excited about, not only because it's one of the programs that pushes the threat even further left of boom, so left of boom is before the actual event happens, a bad actor executes his plan, but also the fact that it's using this blockchain technology, which is becoming more and more popular, and the fact the FBI is always leading with technology, and the fact that it's in the CBRNE WMD space, we're really excited about as well. So I'm gonna go ahead and move to the next slide. I apologize in advance for the brevity of some of the explanations, more or less because of the time constraints, and but we did want to make sure that we're able to present during this event, just because of the topics and our relationship with Stimson as well. We think it adds value at both ends. Real quickly, we had this pilot project where in 2017, we were made aware of a threat bad actors' interests in use to make chemical weapons. We wanted to take a look at that interest and break it down and see how we can mitigate that from taking place here in the U.S. The threat wasn't specific or imminent, so we knew we wanted to create a program to mitigate it in case the threat was to increase. So what we did is we created a pilot program where we were doing outreach to the company that makes precursors or materials to this chemical weapon. And we realized that the industry that makes the items and the chemicals that we're interested in gets these unsolicited requests from quotes from people around the world and companies they've never heard of. And it's more or less spam. They were trashing it. They were throwing it away. They knew they weren't going to entertain it. It wasn't going to be profitable for them. They weren't going to dedicate any resources to responding to that request for quote. And so we took that information, said, hey, there's lots of good data here. It appears they're at least interested, and we want to know why they're interested. So maybe we could use that data to sort of inform a bigger picture. So over the next year and a half, 2 years, we did that manually. We asked industry to voluntarily submit those unsolicited RFQs to the FBI and see what information we could pull out of it. And we pulled a lot of information. We connected a lot of dots, and we were able to connect enough dots to known WMD proliferators that we know we are on the right track, and we need to expand this program. But before we expand the program, we realized there was a bunch of pain points that we needed to solve before we expanded the program beyond the realm of a couple industry partners and beyond 1 or 2 items and chemicals, and definitely beyond domestically and working with our partners internationally. And some of those pain points was the current way of doing business with this program just wasn't sustainable. It wasn't efficient at all. Everything was manually done. So we got these RFQs that were voluntarily submitted to us. Our analysts took information from the RFQ, manually pulled information out, put it in a spreadsheet, and that obviously takes time. It obviously has the possibility of human error as they're copying, pasting, or writing down information in countries and people and names and email addresses. And those types of things are really important if you're trying to make a bigger picture and match commonalities. And also, we knew that we had data that was valuable to other domestic agencies, and the ability to share that data was incredibly cumbersome. There's a way of doing that here in the Bureau and the United States government, and it can take a month, 2 months, 3 months to share that data, despite the fact that all this information is considered unclassified. So there's nothing classified about this information when you share it in its raw form, as we wanted to do. So we knew that we needed to solve some of these pain points, and we identified some requirements. And so this graphic here goes to show our requirements in summary, meaning that we wanted to share data. We knew the data that we wanted to share needed to have high confidence behind it, and needed to be able to be shared quickly. It needed to be shared anonymously from our trusted submitters, which is our industry people who are submitting those unsolicited RFQs. So we need to create this whole community of trust, where trust sometimes isn't always the highest or confident as far as accuracy. So this graphic is just a sample of possibly who we could be working with and some of the agencies we could be working with for this platform. So looking through a bunch of ways to solve this issue beyond just sharing an Excel database, which has all of these pain points, we knew that in assessing other technologies, we knew that using distributed ledger technology was the best way to help us solve those those pain points. And so while doing that, we created this environment where we would illuminate procurement agents and their networks through worldwide reporting and information sharing in near real time. So we're going after people who are attempting to procure CBRNE related materials, connecting the dots, illuminating them through the sharing of information, and the fact that it's being done through it's being done and pushing the thread as far left as possible, meaning these people are just in the idea phase. They're not even close to execution, which is a great thing because we can identify intent, and it requires way less resources to stop those bad actors the further left that we identify their intent. So through the requirements that we identified, here's sort of how we viewed distributed ledger technology as solving some of those requirements. The first one is we needed a decentralized solution where no entity controls all the data, meaning there needs to be not one agency, one country who's a sole repository of all the information that's being shared. So blockchain allows the sharing of and control of the country's own data, meaning they're not giving up control of their data. And there is no centralized repository. Everybody's seeing the same thing, and nobody has the ability to change somebody else's data. The second point is we needed to have a database that can constantly be updated with everyone sharing, with everyone having the same information. Meaning previously we were using Excel database, and if we wanted to share it, aside from the cumbersome way of sharing it, we were essentially just going to email an Excel spreadsheet to somebody. As soon as you email that, that data is out of date because we are going to update it with new data. So we needed to solve that. And blockchain does that because of its inherent capability of near real-time sharing of data in a secure environment. I'm not going to go through all of these points here, but the last one is important to us as FBI, as a law enforcement agency, because in the end, the idea of this platform of the data sharing is to support law enforcement investigations to prevent the use of a WMD. The intention, so the information needs to be reliable. As you know, blockchain provides a full audit trail of information being submitted from the original submitter to the law enforcement agencies being submitted to the country that's submitting the information and the wider database. So what does this look like? I've explained it. Everybody has their own version in their head of what this looks like. So we have a video to sort of help fill out what exactly is going on here. So when you open the CTX program, we have users that are being onboarded, and currently this would be a law enforcement agency user. When you log in, you're able to get a quick view of the countries that have these suspicious RFQs. So sort of the greener the green means the less submissions, and then it gets darker all the way up to the red. So that's just a snapshot, but that can be configurable. You have a snapshot of the most recent submissions, who their email is being submitted, the company, the country, when it was submitted to CTX. And so I use this term trusted submitter. So again, this is industry who receives those unsolicited RFQs. And what you're seeing here is how to onboard those people to be able to submit these requests for quotes. So you give their email address, the person, the company name. That way, when they submit it, we know where it's coming from. And you can further refine it by creating sectors, which you'll see that will be done next. So you would identify if they're just a chemical supply, if they're a specific material supplier. Again, that's all highly configurable based on your need. So once a trusted submitter is added, the trusted submitter will receive a packet to install on their Chrome browser. And when that's done, you can see if they actually installed that extension to be able to upload those RFQs. And you can check that. And so if you onboarded somebody and you're wondering why you haven't heard from them, you can at least see if they installed that option there. So I'm just going to fast forward here because I know we have a limited amount of time. I think we're going to go right here. Okay, so when a trusted submitter submits information, what does that look like? Well, it looks like this. So what it'll do is it'll attempt to capture the submitter's company, what company they work for, if they have a website, the country that they're from, the chemical or material that they're interested in, when the email or quote was sent, and a bunch of other really good information, including obviously their name, their email address. And again, the important thing to point out is that this is done automatically. There's no analyst, there's no human copying and pasting or anything like that. And so what you'll see here next is a truncated version of that unsolicited RFQ. And you can kind of see how accurate it is. Again, this is a very basic request for quote, but you can see what they're requesting. They mention where they're from, where they'd like it to be shipped, and all this other data that the Common Threat Information Exchange platform is able to accurately extract. And again, this is done through parsing of information, and it can be lined up with specific databases, so it can learn specific materials that you may be interested in. And what we're pointing out here is threat indicators. And again, this is highly customizable based on the agency that uses the platform. You can sync it up to an OFAC country, or if it's a person that's on a list that shouldn't be sold this specific type of chemical. The Common Threat Information Exchange platform can create a flag saying, hey, I found this person is not supposed to be requesting this chemical, or this country is not, or somebody from this country is not supposed to be requesting this type of material. That way it helps you prioritize all these RFQs, because we had a high rate of ones that were linked to known WD proliferators, but there were still a ton more than that weren't. So we needed to find a way to prioritize information as it came in. So that's just a snapshot of what it looks like. And I think, again, we're going to fast forward here. And that's just what what it looks like as you use the program. So I know that was a very abbreviated version of what it looks like. Hopefully I didn't run out of time there. But let's go to the next slide. But as far as the presentation, that's what we have for you. So I'm more than happy to answer a couple questions if there are any.
Sure. Thank you very much, Tony. It was really interesting. And I know in another field, in the export control field, I know that Australia used to try to do this many, many years ago, but it was all hand done and dealt with, you know, and of course people got the more companies had compliance programs, the more they found out they were getting all of these transactions, you know, inquiries from suspicious entities. So this looks really cool. So we do have a question from the audience, or actually from one of your panelists. And so maybe we just take that one quickly. So are there specific incentives for industry to take the time to participate in as a trusted submitter?
Yeah, that's a very, very great question, and one that we are fortunately not having to entertain as much as you would think. A lot of our programs, since they're preventative and the FBI is not a regulator, we cannot compel them to voluntarily work with us. And so we always approach it as we're here, in the bigger picture of chemical security, and you have the ability to stop a bad actor from using your chemical or your material in a bigger event. So usually that goes over very well. There's nothing more needed. But as far as working with us on this platform, we're gonna find ways to sort of gamify it, meaning we're going to give them data on information that they're submitting, meaning, hey, you submitted 3 quotes last month, but we didn't hear from you this month. Let's see, and just knowing that information, we hope would incentivize them to submit. And then generally, we're going to have feedback based on if there are any events, that were stopped, or if their information was truly helpful without giving specific information. We're trying to find ways to give feedback that they actually provided great, valuable information that was helpful.
Cool. Well, I'm sure there'll be more questions as we go along towards the end. So let me turn it to my colleague, Cindy Vestergaard. Cindy.
Thank you so much, Rick. I am going to get the presentation loaded. I am super excited to be able to present on this. This is our latest project, the MATCH project. But before I do that, I will talk a little bit about BIP, the Blockchain in Practice program, and then I'll go into the MATCH project. So the Blockchain in Practice program looks at DLT for international security, and international security regimes face a common challenge of ensuring the integrity of data, information flow, and traceability. Some of the things, for example, just from our previous speaker, from Tony, but also from yesterday's sessions. As we've mentioned over the past couple of days, DLT is a trust machine, strengthening data integrity, security, and the traceability of data. Of course, the hashing is one of the factors for immutability, and also the replication among participants for resiliency. And as we've mentioned repeatedly throughout, and a lot of our solutions that have been put forward are permission platforms to provide access and data aligned with confidentiality rules. So you heard yesterday about SLAFCA, and today I'm going to be talking about MATCH, monitoring and tracking materials, the exploration, incubation, and testing of DLT as a novel method to track chemical materials, detect aversion, and monitor treaty compliance with the Chemical Weapons Convention. So the project has received funding from Global Affairs Canada, and we are testing the potential for the technology to effectively address what is called transfer discrepancies that are identified by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, OPCW, in trade flows in some of the most commonly traded Schedule II and Schedule III chemicals. Under the Chemical Weapons Convention, chemicals are categorized, so Schedule I, II, and III. Schedule I would be those chemicals like sarin or soman, where there's only one real objective for them, whereas which is obviously chemical warfare. But Schedule II and Schedule III chemicals are those chemicals where, excuse me, where there is a lot of industrial processes that involve them, everything from hair products to solvents. And so, of course, they are regularly traded, and huge volumes, of course, are as well. But the MATCH project really brings together a diverse group of stakeholders, including the OPCW, a DLT developer, government officials, and industry, to be able to look at, as we develop this prototype, to be able to monitor and track materials. So these Schedule 2 and Schedule 3 chemicals do have declaration requirements under the Chemical Weapons Convention. So for Schedule 2, it's the quantities produced, processed, and consumed, whereas for Schedule 3, it's the quantities produced. Both require declarations on the quantities and quantitative specification of imported and exported chemicals. The OPCW then takes this information that states parties provide them and match up the imports and the exports. The challenge becomes, though, that transfer discrepancies occur when state parties on their declarations to the OPCW on the import and export of these scheduled chemicals don't match. So an example could be one state party declares an export of a scheduled chemical, whereas the party that is exporting it or importing it does not declare any trade of that chemical. It can also be that they have different figures that don't match. Really, one of the issues here with transfer discrepancies, or the issue with transfer discrepancies, is that there is a high rate of them in the annual declarations. So as you can see here, consistently, it is almost 70% that actually have anywhere between 66 to 69% of transfer discrepancies in them. Historically, the OPCW has only been able to resolve less than 15% of transfer discrepancies. So we are really interested in testing the potential for DLT to be able to help. Is this a technological solution that can help this process along? We are going to be looking at the top three in terms of the Schedule 3 chemicals, the most commonly traded chemicals. I am not going to pronounce the first one. I am still working on that, and I hope by the end of the project I will be able to. But one of the things you will notice across them is the number of synonyms that all of them have. And this is something where obviously you can imagine for reporting, inputting of data, and of course as the material moves, whether it be through customs, regulatory authorities, from producers, manufacturers. So this is going to be one of the challenges certainly that we will face. There are also a number of different vendors, and the report traded is quite large by a number of different countries. So as you can see, it's 81 for the first one over the past 5 years. For TEA, the middle one, thank gosh, it has a acronym for that one. 125 countries have reported that over the last 5 years. And then for the phosphorus trichloride, 53 countries over the last 5 years. So these chemicals are subject to international controls, of course, and as I mentioned, they have numerous commercial applications: construction, automotive products, herbicides, and so forth. I do want to make a plug for our book that has just come out, and your panelist here, Andrea Vishki, was wonderful in reviewing a lot of this, but Rick Cupitt has his chapter in there as well. So I do want to make this plug for the book that just came out in October. And it identifies areas where DLT could be applied for better streamlining of global nuclear and chemical supply chains, as well as, of course, how this can increase and enhance assurances in the conclusions of compliance with nonproliferation and disarmament treaties. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cindy. I don't see any questions in the chat for the moment, so maybe we'll just go on to Andrea, and that way we'll reserve a nice chunk of time for everyone. So, Andrea, over to you.
Well, thank you, Rick, and thank you to Stimson for inviting me to present on this panel today. I'm going to be presenting on distributed ledger technology and preventing weapons of mass destruction proliferation and applications for customs operations. So in terms of the outline of the presentation, I'm going to be setting the context in terms of the ways that emerging technologies are applied for nonproliferation. Then I'm going to talk about the specific applications in customs operations and how it actually works, as well as some of the benefits of using DLT for customs operations. I'll give a couple of examples of proof of concepts and pilots, as well as ongoing programs that have begun to be implemented. I will look at gaps and challenges regarding DLT and customs, as well as the outlook for the future and work that remains to be done. So I'll keep this very brief, but in general, the research is kind of motivated by looking at emerging technologies in the nonproliferation context. And whereas there's a lot of research on the threats that emerging technologies pose to nonproliferation, there's also a need to look at the ways that emerging technologies can help strengthen nonproliferation. And there's opportunities to identify technology solutions for very specific nonproliferation operations, such as customs or licensing or some of the other topics that we've discussed so far in this event. And the objectives of this particular research, which really has just been initiated, is to analyze existing proof of concepts and ongoing activities where blockchain has been applied and is being applied in customs environments, and to determine the added value to nonproliferation objectives and assess gaps, challenges, and future work. So the bottom line is that the value of blockchain is increasingly recognized, but a lot of work remains to be done to look at the specific connections between the benefits to customs operations in general and where you can tease out the benefits to nonproliferation specifically. So moving on to the application to customs operations. As we know, there's a lot of challenges to the supply chain in general. There's a very large administrative burden in terms of the amount of documentation and paperwork that has to be exchanged between different stakeholders within the system. So you often have a huge cost and time burden based on all of that documentation. And you also have a harder time organizing and managing the information when you need to use it for risk assessment and targeting, for example. Also, one of the challenges is the traceability of a good as it goes from the consignor to the consignee, knowing exactly where the shipment is at any particular point in time and being able to trace it to its origin. There's the incredible amount of time that is involved in many different, not just supply chain, but customs operations in terms of exchanging relevant information. And in many examples, especially customs agencies that are still using paper systems, you receive information very close to when a shipment arrives, if not afterwards, giving you less time to conduct any relevant targeting and risk assessment and enforcement. And finally, you have the ability to, or the exploitation of different parts of the system for fraud. And that is not just from inputting false information into bills of lading or overvaluing or undervaluing different shipments, but also through the financial system, through the system of correspondent banking and the many different stakeholders involved in just one shipment. So there's a lot of potential for distributed ledger technology to impact for the better many of these challenges. And so first of all, you have the immutable and unchangeable record shared among network participants that is updated in real time, and that all participants can have access to that information and trace it to the cross-border trade and distribution of shipments. And very importantly, customs officials can digitally and in real time verify details such as the origin, physical characteristics, licensing, authenticity, destination and journey of the different shipments that will allow them to distinguish legitimate trade and identify suspicious traders and illegitimate trade and fraudulent practices, and be able to do that with more advanced time and notification than what is currently available. So I'm going to talk about some of the benefits of this application. So the two main ones are transparency and digitalization. So the transparency that the system provides is ensuring authenticity of all of the documentation within that is stored on the blockchain, which then enhances trust, and digitalization, which streamlines the documentation and secures the exchange and monitoring of data. And then there's a number of other specific benefits. So you have the shipping information pipeline, which will allow all of the stakeholders in the system to have a view of where a specific shipment is at any point in time. It's also a paperless system, which there's a surprising amount of customs agencies that still rely on paper-based systems, and even in advanced countries that rely on a single window digital system, it still has to translate some paper-based documentation into that digital platform, because so many countries actually still rely on a paper-based system. There's the verifiable and immutable digital documents. So you have a trace of all of the different documents that are stored on the system. And I'm going to talk more in depth about this in the next slide, but a lot of these benefits are helping develop better risk analysis and targeting, lower administrative costs because it's no longer so timely and burdensome to produce lots and lots of documents and send them here and there to the different stakeholders, but rather it's stored on one platform. It creates faster shipping time, potentially faster shipping times, and then in general can strengthen the revenue collection duties of customs and security vis-a-vis financial crime and proliferation, which is what I really want to focus on now. So in looking at many different examples of proof of concepts and pilot projects and trying to tease out actually where the added value of DLT is to nonproliferation in particular, basically what we see is that better, so blockchain data tracking and aggregation can help identify issues and target suspicious shipments more effectively. But it's important to remember that recording the data on the blockchain doesn't equate to verifying the data. So even though you can upload a bill of lading or other trade documentation, that document can still be fraudulent. So there's still a need to verify that data. But that verification can be helped along by more information that's available, as well as better risk assessment and better data collection and tracking of information, as well as technological advances that are independent of blockchain, but that can also help with verification that exists on the verification of the documentation that is on the blockchain. There's another interesting angle to where DLT can play a role in nonproliferation, which is the financial aspect. And a lot of this is very aspirational and has really just been mentioned as ideas, but is difficult and possibly timely to actually implement. But a lot of vulnerabilities come through the financing of different trade operations, and specifically, for example, correspondent banking, where a domestic bank will use the services of a foreign bank in order to help finance the trade. And they rely on that foreign bank for its knowing who the producer is, having a good know your customer system. And often, that creates a lot of vulnerability for fraud. And so having blockchain could be used within the financial system to actually take away some of the middlemen and have banks communicate to each other on a blockchain. Also, the blockchain could potentially better combat trade-based money laundering through more information, and through that information being stored on a blockchain, which again helps with better information sharing and risk assessment and targeting. So a couple of examples briefly. I won't go in detail into all of them, but important to note is that these are all proof of concepts and pilots, as well as operations that have been applied to very specific areas of customs activity. So in the case of Cadena, which includes Mexico, Peru, Chile, and Costa Rica, this blockchain system was set up to facilitate the exchange of information relevant to authorized economic operators to help the efficient implementation of mutual recognition agreements. And previously, the information was emailed from one customs agency to another, and it took about a month for that recognition to take place. But through the block entry into a blockchain, that saves a significant amount of time, and it also immediately can help the agents flag something that looks fraudulent and be able to act on it before it's too late. There's another great example that is a proof of concept that the US Customs and Border Protection Office applied to verify NAFTA and CAFTA certificate of origins. And I can go more into that in the Q&A. And then there's several other examples. Again, these are usually applied to very specific customs operations, because at this point, most of them are trying to see exactly where they can be applied to give that added value and to reap some of the benefits that I described earlier of transparency and digitalization. So to start concluding the presentation, of course, there's a number of gaps and challenges. So as I mentioned, many of the ongoing initiatives are limited in scope. There's a lot of barriers to adoption and that are cultural, technological, and political, and relate to willpower and buy-in, as well as the lack of knowledge and broad public trust, which links to blockchain literacy. And one of the big ones that's been brought up, especially in the US example of the CPB, is interoperability between whatever blockchain specific government agency will use, and then blockchains that exist with the private sector companies that they work with, and being able to interoperationalize different blockchains in order to get the benefits that we discussed. And then standardization and legal and regulatory frameworks, which apply to what government agencies can do with specific data sets that they gain access to, how those are used, and how they are regulated. So there's still a lot of challenges in that regard. So finally, to conclude, in terms of future outlook, there's a lot of potential to look more deeply into existing proof of concept of blockchain applications to customs, and as well as ongoing programs, and see how they are able to give value to non-proliferation efforts, especially regarding targeting and risk assessment, as well as that financial aspect. So it could be useful to have more research looking at comparing different systems that have been tried out, and looking at best practices in terms of those proof of concepts and operations, identifying specific gaps and how to resolve them, working on that issue of the legal and regulatory frameworks and seeing if there are best practices there, and then building trust, knowledge, and acceptance that this could be a solution not just for countries that have very advanced technology, but countries that currently rely almost exclusively on a paper-based system to be able to become more efficient and transparent. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, Andrea. It was again, there's a lot of interesting opportunities. We've got plenty of time for question and answer, and again, please if you've got questions from the audience, please, if you would, enter your questions in the YouTube chat, and they'll be sent to me. A couple of things, though. One, Tony Bliss had to, unfortunately, had to leave, but note his colleague David Centofonte, he's the management and program analyst at the FBI, will, as I understand it, join the next session for any questions on CTIX. So I think there's plenty, though, of meat to chew here. So let me, and I'll jump in and ask a question. This first one is for Andrea. You said you could speak a little bit more about the Customs and Border Protection, Border Patrol Protection, the Office proof of concept on the certificate of origins. That's a huge problem around the world, and this is so I'd be very curious to see if you've got what else you could say about it.
Sure. I appreciate the question. I wanted to stick to the time frame, so it's great to have the opportunity to go a little bit more in depth into that specific case. So in that case, first of all, they didn't use blockchain they didn't do the proof of concept to prove that a blockchain would be better or would replace the current system. They just wanted to see if it was viable and what the benefits and what the challenges would be. And one of the reasons is because CPB currently uses what's called an automated commercial environment. So it's a single window system that does rely on electronic filing. However, they're filed not just with electronic submissions, but with paper submissions. And so the current system does have some redundancy, and sometimes managing all of the paperwork can take a lot of time to be processed and shared among all of the entities involved. So they wanted to see how using a blockchain could work, and not necessarily replace the system, but whether it was a viable system. And so what they did was apply it to verifying free trade agreements and the movement of goods that are coming from different NAFTA and CAFTA members. And what they used one of the blockchains, and it wasn't mentioned, it's not public exactly which were the companies that were participating, but basically they found that the system could be interoperable with blockchains of the companies that were involved in this proof of concept, and that they didn't have to use a single platform. And that it actually was a viable system that saved a lot of time, and that was able to recognize or have the agents recognize the certificates of origin in a more efficient manner in order to move forward with the trade under the different platforms or the different systems than what the current system is. And I think that they've tried another proof of concept that's been ongoing specific to counterfeit goods, because they really wanted to see what kind of proof of concepts or operations would be would incentivize industry to participate. And so if there's some kind of benefit to industry, then they're more likely to want to participate in these kinds of programs. Another example is that some of the pilots are being applied within the EU and the UK after Brexit to see if there's a way to automate or make the system more efficient and less time consuming and document heavy for trade between the UK and EU member states post Brexit. And so creating that incentive for companies to want to join these different pilot programs.
Thanks, Andrea. In fact, we've got a question from Crew Dixon. It's regarding that very thing, the buy-in by industry, and thinking about how do we incentivize parties to adopt DLT. it's also asked if you have any thoughts on trade lens, because they've done well apparently, but their pilots may be having some trouble because they didn't get enough users to really be a good pilot. I don't know if you can address that specifically, but you certainly, thinking more about incentivizing parties. I would note that also Tony mentioned that just telling companies that that they could prevent something really terrible happening, which especially if it involved their reputation, I imagine is a big issue, is a big incentive for some companies. So either one of you, I think, could be an interesting question. How do we get parties? I think one may be industry, but for things like match, Cindy, also is how do we get countries, state parties to the convention interested in participating? What can we do to incentivize? So Cindy first, maybe, and then Andrea.
Sure. Well, we're in the early hours of the project, but certainly socialization, outreach about the technology is going to be a big part of the project. So there's prototype development, but outreach really is a big aspect of everything that we do in the Blockchain in Practice program, and particularly with this project. It's one of the things first in getting people involved is to show the demo, right? And does it work? Can it handle these transactions? Is it able to provide an easy user experience as well? So those types of things will certainly be important. And we are hoping that once the demo's out there, that that could motivate also more reporting. I mean, the demo is not going to be adopted or commercialized. It's certainly just there for a proof of concept and to demonstrate how the technology could work here. But I think that we could, see from there potentially chemical companies might be interested in this for their own supply chains. We do know some companies are already starting to engage in that. Our research is very nascent at this point, but in some ways we're actually surprised how many chemical companies don't yet have blockchain initiatives. But we are starting to see that shifting. And so I think we will be able to, and particularly with COVID, we certainly heard a lot more with the need for no-touch systems, for resiliency to be built into cyber and digital processes. So I think we might start to see a shift, even just in terms of what's been happening over the past couple of years with supply chains.
Andrea?
So what I have to add to this is that in the research that I've done so far on the different proof of concepts and pilots and ongoing projects, there's a better success for industry to be involved if they see a benefit to themselves, obviously. So some of these are focusing, like I mentioned, on issues like counterfeit goods, which impact the bottom line of industry. So if they recognize that there's a technology that could potentially help them solve that problem, then they're going to be interested and want to participate. The same with the kind of new administrative burden that many companies are facing with trade between the UK and the EU because of Brexit. And again, proof of concept and pilot projects that look to ease that through a blockchain platform are interesting to companies. But also, and I guess that this is where, technologies like trade lens come in. There is the potential overall benefit for the private sector to reduce their administrative burden and costs through the eventual application of this technology to trade. In some cases, there are there's so much time and there's so many hurdles with getting the good from the consignor to the consignee that the administrative cost is as much as the shipping cost. And so if there's a potential for those costs and for that amount of time to be reduced, then you would probably see some interest from industry. But there's definitely more to be done in terms of looking at, where those incentives could, where they meet the interests of the government authorities and where they can work together. A lot of these technologies are used by port authorities or by companies, but aren't integrated with customs per se. And so it's still really at a nascent stage, and there is a need to look at where those interests can merge.
Well, thanks, Andrea. I think one of the things I think that cuts across all three of the presentations is that this is just a common thread, I think, here is that you're not approaching DLT as a solution in search of a problem, but there are problems in search of solutions. And so when we start to think about, what would be incentive for industry, that's where we should keep that focus, is that, what's the problem that DLT can solve, or what problems can it solve? And I think in each of the presentations today, we heard quite a bit about that this was a real problem. These are real problems that DLT fits, where its use could be really useful. But as I think you noted, solutions using new technologies meet challenges when they move to deployment. And Andrea, you mentioned a number of them. I would note even, I think with Crew Dixon's question was about pilots, and if you don't even get enough participants in pilots, then you haven't even got to the issues of the challenges that will come when you're trying to scale up the deployment of the technology. So besides, I think the proper focus of trying to find, well, identify the benefits, the specific benefits that would come from companies participating or countries participating in international organizations. What other things can we do to help overcome these challenges that we see when we move basically from this kind of tech awareness raising pilot to actual deployment? Are there some lessons we can learn from its use elsewhere in other contexts, or just any ideas that you have on how we can approach this? This for either one.
Sure, I can jump in. I'm certainly interested, as we're doing the match project with the chemical tracking, what the overlaps we're going to see with SLAFCA, for example, and what else we're going to learn about when it comes to nuclear security practices, chemical security practices, and really looking at chemical, nuclear, biological factors that certainly relate to the other regimes. And so again, with the security regimes all struggling with data integrity, traceability, how to share information in secure ways, I think we'll really be able to, once we have a number of proof of concepts out there, be able to extract trends for the wider regimes. And I'm really excited about that, because I think there is going to be a lot of lessons that can be learned, of course, from each of them. Even though the international organizations don't have mandates all the time to talk to each other, I think we will have an ability to extract what are the trends that come out of this, what we're learning with the different prototypes. So that I think it should certainly be able to take supply chain enterprise solutions that are out there, what are their best practices, what are their experiences, and then looking at that through a lens with the international security lens.
Thanks. We got a question from Sarah Fraser, and it's for both of you. Do you have any insights into the costs that were imposed on organizations to initiate the platform and the network, and if there were financial savings that were gained from that implementation, and either the specific projects that we've been examining or others that you know about? Either Cindy, Andrea, either one. Andrea, why don't you start?
Also, by answering the previous question and just adding a brief comment there, that I haven't had the ability to compare the way that DLT is applied in the customs environment to other applications of it, specifically. But I think that in order to scale it up, there's probably some work to be done on comparing the different programs and pilots, the way that they're applied, and extracting best practices and lessons learned that can be applied in different pilots and programs, but also when it's scaled up. And something that that has been really interesting through this research, and that I'm going to look into more, is the way that it's applied for the financial part of these transactions, and specifically all the different financial institutions that are involved in a shipment, in a trade, and whether there's an application of blockchain so that all of the parties can actually see the relevant data in real time, so that because often the domestic financial institution doesn't have availability or can't see the processes of the correspondent bank in another country, which leads to opportunities for fraud. And also there can be a discrepancy between the standards, the financial compliance standards of the domestic bank and the foreign bank. And so that's just kind of another area that I think would be really, that's tied to this, that really could be looked at more deeply to then be, that relates to the whole customs issue as well. In terms of the costs, frankly, I didn't come across any specific numbers or data related to whether any of these programs that I looked at did save costs for a company, but I would imagine that if implemented in an efficient and large scale manner, they would, simply because of the costs associated with the administrative burden of the current system, and all of the time and all of the exchange of documents between different stakeholders, and all of the processing costs involved in that. So potentially I can see that there would be a big saving there, but I don't have numbers, and I haven't run across any study that looked specifically at the cost savings yet.
Thanks.
Sorry. Yeah, for Match, of course, this is, I mean, we're dealing with, firstly, with declarations to the OPCW. So in terms of cost savings, that's, I'm not sure what that would look like yet until we do the demo. But in terms of companies, we have seen some companies with different DLT prototypes, even commercialized adoption platforms, where they will say anywhere from 60 to 70 to 80% of administrative costs have been reduced. So of course it will depend on the industry, it will depend on the supply chain, and in terms of what we're dealing with, it's international security, so it's hard to know what costs are, particularly until we develop the prototype, and what are also the barriers and opportunities that are there for adoption. So once we have that in place, then I think we'll have a better sense what the different variety of costs may be.
And just one more thing to add, that also for the government agencies, so the different customs agencies that are involved in some of these pilots, even though they don't talk about savings for their agencies, there are clear benefits, like in the case of Cadena, being able to transfer information about the AEOs in real time means that there's less work involved in emailing back and forth different documents, and also that speeds up trade. So I feel there's probably a whole lot of different cost savings that aren't necessarily just money, but also time. And then of course, in the context that we're looking at this issue, the cost of ultimately, the cost of some kind of a weapon would, being used is what we're trying to avoid. So there's kind of that security benefit, which isn't really, you can't really monetize it, but of course in the long term and the ultimate objective, that's what we're focusing on.
Well, thanks. And I certainly see it important for a number of these institutions, government institutions, that are face considerable resource restraints already. So, you know, the many international institutions are under zero growth budgets, and then they get more tasks added to them. So anything that can reduce the time, you know, and that's a certain part of an important part of their resources that can reduce the time applied to, let's say, emailing a spreadsheet, uh, is going to be, I think, attractive to international institutions and to several governments that are not flush with cash, especially as we are attempting to come out of the recovery from during the pandemic. And I would know, if I recall, Cindy, you might also, I think under Slavka, it was a, you know, an example of this would be how much time would be saved by inspectors in terms of doing things. So I do think it's could be considerable savings here. Andrea, you had your
Certainly.
hand up too.
Yeah,
So.
certainly in terms of times not needed to be spent anymore on reconciling state and operator records. So for book inspections, it's certainly, or for the inspector, book inspections become far more efficient.
Well, if you have any more questions, please put them in the YouTube chat function if there's any more. We still got a few minutes left.
I'll add something, Rick, if there's.
Go for it.
So again, on costs, there's another interesting aspect or benefit to blockchain that was meant that, you know, I came across in some of these cases, and that relates to cybersecurity. And that because if you email information back and forth, it's more vulnerable to be stolen. But also the vulnerability of paper documents and digital documents that aren't on a blockchain and are transferred with different nodes, that actually there's a potential for the blockchain to enhance the security of the information on the blockchain. And that some of the sensitive information doesn't have to be stored on the blockchain. It can be on a protected server that those with permission can access. But so that just decreases the amount of information being transferred through different means like email.
Well, I think that may have some additional benefits as we move to things like small modular reactors that are going to look at and put in remote places and are going to very much rely on increased digital exchanges and information, and then, or as shipping companies automate some of their materials, there'll be, as you say, lots of digitally transferred information, and so that creates the cybersecurity benefits should not be, I think, overlooked. Well, if any other final comments by our panelists?
No, other than to say I'm really excited to be able to present again on Match in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and talk about the progress that we're making and what we're learning. Already so far, what we're just learning about the 3 most commonly traded Schedule 3s, for example, is eye-opening. And so I look forward to communicating again on how the project is progressing.
Great. Well, then, let me thank everybody for participating and joining us today. And let me give special thanks to our panelists. And it's always great to be moderator of a panel where everybody pays attention to the time constraints. So I really appreciate that. The presentations will be on the event webpage. And we're going to, hopefully everyone's going to return, and we'll see you again at 1 o'clock, and have a great roundtable to close out this fall BIP event. So thank you, everyone. Ciao.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Rick, for great moderation.
Welcome back to everybody. It is a pleasure to be able to moderate the last session of the Hashing the Atom webinar. I hope that everyone had a good lunch, although some of you, of course, we've got a variety of different time zones across our panelists. So from Sydney, Australia to the UK to, of course, here in the US and even to Canada. So with that, let me just quickly reintroduce myself. My name is Cindy Vestergaard. I'm the director of the Blockchain and Practice Program at the Stimson Center. And sorry, I just realized I have the live stream going on at the same time. Sorry for any feedback. And we have a great group with us today. It is a mix from academia, DLT developers, those who are actually developing solutions, government as well. So we have Edward Aubert, who is joining us from Sydney, Australia, from the University of New South Wales, where he is a researcher, and also who was one of our partners in developing SLAFCA, the world's first blockchain prototype for nuclear safeguards information management. We have David Centofante, Management and Program Analyst at the US Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. John Geeter, Chief Technical Officer at Jistuin. You might have heard him speak earlier yesterday. Michelle Lenny, Vice President of Business Development at OARO. She also spoke yesterday. And Sarah Su, who is a visiting fellow at Fudan University FinTech Research Center, and who has published a really good report on blockchain in China. So we will put that in the link for the live chat as well, so that you can access that. It's a pleasure to have you all. Thank you for being here. So this is no presentations, it's just conversation, but I think we're going to get into some really interesting discussions regarding DLT. It's in terms of its adoption, commercialization, testing, and where it can go in the future as well. So I'm going to start off by asking one really important question here. And that is, of course, the DLT, we've even mentioned it during the webinar, has been called a trust machine. A tool for building trust across ecosystems. All of you have experience in developing DLT platforms or researching how DLT can be applied. What is your experience with how DLT builds trust? And I'll start the conversation with Michelle.
Myself, thank you, Cindy. Building trust is extremely critical, especially in highly regulated industries. So the industry that I've spoke of yesterday that I'm very focused on with OARO is the nuclear industry and the small modular reactor industry. And when we think about the types of information and data, and even from a supply chain perspective, the supply chain parts and goods that are being provided in such a high regulated industry, the industry stakeholders having trust in the data that they're looking at, in the information that they're relying on to make decisions, and on the parts and goods and services that are coming to these nuclear stations and SMR sites is absolutely critical. It is absolutely a game changer in terms of being able to deliver a trust model to them by which they can trust what they're seeing and what their partners can see. And I would say the flip side of that, the biggest challenge is because it's new and it is a game changer, blockchain, that's probably the biggest challenge we have is continually communicating and building trust with them that it does, in fact, exactly what we say it will do.
John, what are your thoughts on, or your experience, I should say, in how DLT builds trust?
I think, well, as an extension of what we just heard, the value of the immutability and the strict timestamps and the shared nature of DLT means that everybody has a copy of the record. And I think, again, echoing the things that we heard yesterday, this doesn't mean that everybody has every record, but everybody has that kind of summary of the decision we made that said, yes, it's okay to move this thing from one state to another, and I'm going to move my responsibility from me over to you. And that's the piece that's kept there. So the value of DLT fundamentally is that it has a very strong, indisputable copy of that transaction and the information that was, and the understanding that was present at the time of that transaction in order to move responsibility and risk along a chain. And that works out really nicely, because if people have ever had experience of having an industrial incident, the amount of time that's wasted in diving into other people's databases and arguing about timestamps and wondering if they've shredded something or simply, the small supplier you were using is no longer in business and you can't get at their stuff no matter how hard you try it. All of that pain of the remediation, the root cause analysis, and the audit goes away with blockchain. No question about it. It's a great step forward in that. But all it does is allow you to hold people to account. It tells you what they said. It doesn't tell you what was actually the truth. So the next kind of frontier on this that I'm seeing in building true trust, and the kind of the levels of sensitivity and safety criticality that we work with, is in that next layer of, well, okay, so now we've got something that proves when something goes wrong, I know it was person A or person B. This person said the wrong thing, or this person heard the wrong thing, and they made a bad decision and stuff went wrong. That's okay. That's still better than we have today. But what we now want to move on to is something that also has that degree of data quality to those inputs in the first place. So not just catching people in a lie or catching people being lazy or making mistakes, but actually stopping that in the first place. So that's where we've got to. People who simply have an insurance mindset, we're making great strides, because this is wonderful for clearing up insurance claims at a fraction of the cost, right? But people who have an actual prevention mindset, we're still not quite there with the data quality, I think.
That's an interesting point, and I think one we'll come back to, particularly with the insurance side of things. Edward, what are your thoughts on building trust?
Hi, Cindy. So I think, well, trust is built up over time, and DLT doesn't necessarily helps to enforce that, but doesn't automatically enforce that. But something it really does do is, I think it creates it's this shared idea of data, whereas right from the initiation stage of a project, right from the beginning, when you just talk to the stakeholders, from the outset, you're talking about our data and our blockchain and our system, in a way which is not actually the case if you're working on a centralized system. You're saying, use my portal or send me your data. It's different. It's not so shared, and I think it's important to see that goes right back to the beginning of a project. And you have conversations when developing a blockchain system, like, how are we going to work out consensus, which you just don't talk about if it's a centralized system. So I think that kind of shared development model is particularly powerful, because at the end of the day, of course, you can put junk on a blockchain, can't you? Just because it's blockchain doesn't make it true. But the way that, as I said, it encourages participation right from the beginning, I think builds trust over time.
That's a very good point. Right from the beginning, it is actually a collaborative approach in terms of how the consensus and the rules of the road are going to be. David, you are, with the CTX, you've got a proof of concept that I think would be very interesting, because you also want this to go across, be shared with governments.
Yeah, and I think, to kind of piggyback on what all of our presenters have said, is blockchain technology, or DLT, is a particularly good solution when there is no voluntary or obvious single source of truth. It becomes very difficult when there are individuals or organizations with competing interests, where they cannot find a single source of truth that is voluntarily able and willing to take in the data. A good example of this is CTX. Because of the work that we've done, we actually canvassed the international community to say, hey, if we collected this information, where could we store it? And everyone kind of pointed this way. And so that's one of the things that is a true of blockchain technology, is it provides us, as you said, it's kind of a trust machine. But to piggyback on what Edward said, it's not a full solution. There's a technical solution, and then there's a governance solution. And you need to make sure that you have a robust community that is supporting both. You need very good developers, and then you need a very good plan of how you're going to manage the blockchain, how you're going to manage consensus, how you're going to manage the movement of information, and in our case, the actioning of information. What if something comes across our desk on on a suspicious request for quote that obviates or illuminates a suspicious or a nefarious actor. So there's a lot in there. I mean, I think everyone really recognizes that blockchain is not it's not a panacea. It's not going to fix all your problems.
I think there might be some audio issues with David, but that's fine. Sarah, I will go to you next. And you know, particularly in the context of China, I'd be curious what you have come across in your research.
Yeah, so you know, I have a little bit of a different flavor of answer. I have a bunch of examples of what China is doing because it really has put a lot of policy backing behind blockchain. And because the government believes that it really does create trust. So one example of this is a trade finance blockchain platform for cross-border payments. And so we saw that this happened in November 2020. The trade finance blockchain platform and the Hong Kong Monetary Authority's E-Trade Connect platform connected with one another. And this was the first case of a cross-border collaboration across different trade finance blockchain platforms. We also see that China has been using it in its cross-provincial housing provident fund platform. So it uses blockchain to support residents in real time for withdrawing their housing provident funds. And so, you know, it's really well integrated into daily life. We're becoming so right now. Also, there's a new area that's being built outside of Beijing that is kind of like a new seat of government. It's a larger territory, and so China is working in that area to do a lot of blockchain experiments. So there are blockchain applications of you know, different kinds of bills and land transfers and management, judicial deposits, supply chain finance, and a lot of things. And I'll just give one more example, although I could go on and on, but there's also the Trusted Blockchain Promotion Plan that promotes research and industry application of blockchains. And it also helps to support updating blockchain standards and also helps to support government decision making. And so, you know, this is a plan that has about 500 members, and these are all like top ranked enterprises that are all joined together to help explore blockchain. There are many more examples I could talk about.
And we will get to some of them, not all, but I'm sure we will get to a lot of them. So, you know, moving forward on that, or you know, building trust is obviously going to be a big part of acceptance as well. But what are the barriers that have been encountered as you've been going through in terms of research, adoption, prototyping? I'll start kind of in the middle here, and then I'll just pull from others. Let's start with John.
Gosh, lots. So I think I was quite heavy yesterday on pointing out the practicalities of adoption. So, you know, if you try to, and even to Edward's answer a moment ago, I mean, things like consensus are lovely in theory, but if you're asking industrial or, you know, Victorian era businesses to understand how to run those kinds of infrastructures, I mean, honestly, look even at the cutting edge of native Web3 blockchain people, and you will not find a willing consortium anywhere. Nobody wants to run a node. Nobody has any idea how to do consensus. Nobody wants to employ the staff or run the compute or deal with the, you know, creating a new political system in order to make this thing actually work. It's incredibly complicated, and it's not actually worth people's time. So the first important thing, I think, is that you've got to get the right balance of serviced capability with integration so that you disrupt as little as possible for best possible value. Because otherwise, if you go in telling people they've got to change everything and they've got to have an entire blockchain department, you're dead instantly. It's just not going to happen. The other thing that I think and that's not very surprising, right? I mean, low friction PCS is just, yeah, that's just true. But the other thing that has been very surprising to me as we've gone through this journey is that, obviously blockchain is software, it's computers, it's digital. So, pretty much most of the time, if you enter a prospect or a project, you end up in the IT department, or if it's cybersecurity, you might end up with the CISO. And very, very many times as we go through this journey and we're running projects and we're going through the acceptance loop, it turns out that the supporters of these things come from operations departments and handling and logistics and finance even. People who actually have a job to do and see how much better their job can be if they take this thing on, you get huge support from. IT departments, in my experience, can be extremely resistant because they don't want to open up their firewalls. They don't want to change the way things work. They don't want to understand a new way of integrating identity systems or key management or things like that. And the fact that, in many cases, their arguments are simply wrong, technically wrong, provably wrong. They are not as secure as they claim to be. They are not as effective as they claim to be by putting in another app firewall or some CTI plugin for their site. They won't change. And I think that's the surprising barrier, is that you get kicked to the IT department and the IT department doesn't want to know because it's different and it's foreign and it's not what they already buy. So that shared control, which is so great for the operations people, is scary to IT.
That is fascinating. Michelle, I'm actually going to turn to you as another company. Is that something you've been finding as well?
Oh, I just loved what John just spoke about, and I was nodding the entire time, and I agree with everything you've said. I'm going to come at it from a little bit of a different angle. So exactly based on what you've said, there absolutely, in a blockchain solution, has to be consensus amongst the users that'll be contributing to it. And I'll go back and talk about the nuclear and SMR industry as an example. So if you look at using a blockchain solution for supply chain, where there is a great amount of counterfeit, fraudulent, suspect item parts, you think about the only way to have a successful blockchain model is to have the 8 or 9 or 10 large manufacturers, suppliers who supply to the nuclear industry, their sub-suppliers and distributors all participating in the greater good, because they all have a lot to win. But to your example, where do you start within an organization of, we know that this is a trust-based solution and it will solve these problems? My experience has been, you absolutely have to start with the C-level executives that own the issues and problems that need to be solved. Not within, and I agree with you, the IT, OT organizations is not the right place to start, for the simple reason is they don't own the budgets. They don't own the problems. They are given the strategic direction before the beginning of a fiscal year, along with the budgets of what they need to do to support the business lines in the organization. So starting at the C level, so the VPs or the chief nuclear officers or the chief supply chain officers are the folks that really truly own the issues. They're the people that have accountability, they're responsible, and they also own the budgets, and they care to solve these problems. So, and I learned this through the School of Hard Knocks, that this is absolutely the people we need to be dealing with, who can bring along the suppliers that deal with them and bring along and let the IT and OT folks know that they need to be participating in this. So I agree 1,000%. And from my experience, that is the route to success, is to get to those people. And typically these people are not typically really strong when it comes to IT, OT, and especially talking about blockchain. So it needs to be spoken to them in terms, I call them layman's terms, of how it's going to solve their business problems and business issues. And how am I going to save them money, mitigate risk, and really increase their profile from a security perspective. So.
Great, thank you. And that's very interesting from the developer side. I mean, you need to start at those who have the vision, right? Strategic visions and the power of budgets and programs. So David, have you noticed any, when you've been doing your demo and any barriers that you might expect to come across? Because you're going to be looking at governments, of course, too, and their IT departments.
Let me tell you, it's been so easy. I can sit here and lie to you all day and tell you how simple it's been to convince our management. And I was thinking, John, as you were speaking, about how I can respond to that and keep my job, right? I think one of the really interesting things is the culture of an organization as well. Some organizations I think would be classified as like really progressive, and they're totally willing to adopt new technology. I think the number of those is very small. It probably occupies like 5 to 10%. And then there's like the 80% that are they say that they're really progressive, but they're not. And then there's like really, really regressive organizations that fall in kind of that bottom end of the bell curve. And you need to know where you're coming at. You need to know who you're talking to. I've had many conversations, both on the operational level, and that's where I sit, is on the operational level, and that's where this is really kind of derived and been pushed from, is the operational level up to management, up to the C-level organization. And I don't think I can sit here and offer you a perfect solution. Maybe one thing that I found is find evangelists in your organization. They exist. And maybe it's not even in your organization. I know I've collaborated with Cindy for a handful of years, and it's every time I walk away from a conversation with her, I'm like, yeah, we can do this. This is great. We're headed in the right direction. And I actually just found a few others in the FBI, in a totally different division, but they see the vision, they get it, they want to help me push. And so finding other evangelists in your organization, I think one, will refresh your approach. And two, it'll find you allies that might be able to push at another angle that maybe you haven't tried yet. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. I think you'll keep your job, at least for a little while longer. Sarah, I mean, with what kind of barriers is China? I mean, China is a different beast in many respects, right? We're talking about a nation state. We're talking also about talking about culture, far more authoritarian, obviously, in terms of the platforms that are put out. But what do you find when it comes to barriers potentially in China?
If there are barriers, which I'm sure there are, most likely technological barriers, but I think they're really not widely discussed, just because blockchain is a top-down technology that's being supported by the government. And so I think that blockchain is something that's widely accepted in China. That doesn't mean that it's widely used. And I think it is harder for like more traditional organizations to implement. But there are a whole host of blockchain companies that are setting up like just to support firms' blockchain implementation. And China also has what's called a blockchain service network. And this is a sort of like internet for blockchain protocols. And it's supposed to allow interoperability between different blockchain protocols to kind of unite them. And so I think that, in that sense, it's relatively unique. And China is now also interested in expanding this to One Belt, One Road. And there's certainly been a lot of support for blockchain research, lots of government funding, which we don't necessarily see in other countries. There's also industrial policy on applying blockchain to different types of scenarios, whether it's within companies or within cities, as I was just talking about with the Chang'an new area and so on. And yeah, there are a lot of companies that are working to integrate blockchain, like especially financial companies and energy companies. I think finance is the most widely used, not only in the West, but also in China. And so it's being used for things like trade finance and supply chain finance and more everyday types of scenarios, which makes it really interesting. I guess China may be ahead simply because it has the government brawn to do that to some extent.
Well, definitely. I mean, what was the figure you have in your paper? It's close to 59,000 patents by 2000, international patents by 2019
Yeah.
in China. So when we're talking about acceptance, if the state is putting forward a strategic vision, certainly for blockchain, which there are a number of countries that have now coming out with national policies, which certainly will help to move things forward and at least help create conversations around the technology. So I think that's really interesting in the China sense. Edward, what about your thoughts in terms of DLT and nuclear safeguards? No, you're muted.
Yeah, so I think the real impetus to implement blockchain in nuclear safeguards is efficiency, because the number of transactions in nuclear safeguards and in nuclear security are increasing all the time, and will increase wildly if nuclear power is adopted more, as certainly since the COP meeting it seems like it might be. Yet the IAEA operates on a fixed budget, so I think there's room for solutions like blockchain when people genuinely have a problem, right? So you can go from your email to your properly digitized solution, and then if that's not enough, well, you need something more. And so there could be a real problem where you need something which is more collaborative, does things like transit matching inherently and takes the work out of that, and which brings people into the system in a more effective way. So definitely times of change, I think, is one impetus for implementing blockchain, where people may have no other way of doing this job in such an efficient way. Also, I think just on our experience, Cindy, of developing proofs of concept and so on, is I think it's the potential of blockchain systems to add value right across the whole sort of development cycle of a project. And so thinking of what David was saying about finding your allies in an organization, sometimes your allies are actually not tech allies. Sometimes they want you to be there because of your engagement potential. Sometimes people want you to be there because they want to show other organizations that they're using blockchain, or that they actually want to use the whole process as a tool for some other objective which may not be directly technological. Okay, so I think we need to be aware of that, of the value that we bring, right across right across the application of a new technology. So that's me.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to pose the next question specifically to our DLT companies. So to John and Michelle, what are the cost efficiencies? What are you finding? Michelle, I'll start with you in terms of the actual implementation, because you've got commercial projects now.
We do. It's interesting. Many of the commercial projects that we're working on in our clients, and I can think of some really large pharmaceutical manufacturing companies, I like to think of things in terms of ROI, return on their investment. And sometimes when you're speaking about, the nuclear industry, money is often not the only thing they're taking into consideration. They're looking for the operational efficiencies. But I would say that the ROI from the projects I've been involved in, typically once the solution's been developed, is less than 6 months. Not only is the ROI less than 6 months, the cost savings related to the efficiencies that Edward was speaking about is often in the 7-digit figures for some of these organizations. And these are hard dollars saved. So these are because the efficiencies have been improved. If you look at just digitizing processes and then doing it on blockchain, there's a significant amount of savings from a paper-based storage perspective. But then redeploying resources, and I'll use one quick example. Looking at the nuclear industry, a lot of the nuclear stations that are just, for example, running 1 unit or 2 units, they have very large departments that are heavily focused on physical auditing in the supply chain. So if you look at a unit, a physical auditing unit that's 10 or 12 full-time FTEs, the loaded salary cost of these people that are essentially spending, 10, 12 months of the year traveling around to manufacturers, suppliers, doing the boots on the ground, doing the physical audits, if you move something like that process to a blockchain, it's not that you can eliminate 10 or 12 bodies off the bottom line, but there's a significant cost savings to that process, and then you can redeploy those resources to other highly innovative areas of the organization. So it's there's many different pluses. Process efficiencies, serious cost savings, the ROI on their investment in this solution is phenomenal. So it's
Seven-digit figures is quite a number, and so you're saying that can be saved even within 6 months. That's what you're saying.
100%. The first business case, business rationalization business case that we co-built with one of our major pharmaceutical companies. This was a document signed off on by the general manager running this facility in year 1 of the project.
Wow, that is amazing. John, do you have any other thoughts there?
Yeah, just a very quick comment on the last point that was made. Outside of nuclear, as I mentioned, we do a lot of stuff with just sort of civil and industrial type operations as well. And it absolutely is about freeing up people to do other jobs, right? This is not, a lot of people complain about digital transformation and say, oh, you're taking our jobs away. And, we get the whatever 200-year-old Luddites come out saying you can't take our jobs away and give them to the robots. That isn't what we're doing. In cases of safety management and cybersecurity management and access control, the skills do not exist. These people are far too busy already. And what you tend to find is that you have sort of trained security engineers or trained, handlers. And in this industry in particular, as I'm finding, a lot of the most skilled handlers are also, not the youngest people around. And you're not going to have them in the workforce for terribly long. So having a system in place that frees up their time to actually do skilled work and look at the things that need looking at, rather than spending most of their time filling in forms to say, yes, I definitely checked this thing, that was definitely fine, just the same as it was definitely fine last week when I checked it. That's where we're getting all of the ROI. So it's nothing about sort of raw cost saving and putting people onto social security. It's about, we are swamped. We cannot do our job properly with the amount of stuff we have to do, with the dearth of skills that exist, unless we can free up all of this administrative time of the paperwork and checking the paperwork and then sending the paperwork and then checking the paperwork was sent and then doing all of that on the other side again. So that's absolutely the core of everything we ever do with this system is that. I would just say, since you were asking for numbers, outside of that, we have, in a former company, I have to say, is the only time I've ever really been able to do an ROI calculation that was long enough and that was endorsed by the customer. But in that case, it was an aerospace, very, very similar to what my platform does now, and not quite the same as OARO, but similar kind of area. That was an aerospace use case, and they got an instant 30%, 5 or 6 different areas, but the overall operating costs of running that supply chain were reduced by 30% pretty much immediately. And those are big numbers. So
those certainly are. And I mean, when I think about also with Slavka, and what we found was, again, with the book inspections, but, inspectors or the data that the International Atomic Energy Agency has is exponential to what they had 20 years ago, 10 years ago even. So if you look back to the, first years of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty being enforced in the early 70s, the agency would get around 16,000 declarations a year. Now it's over 1 million annually. So inspectors, I mean, what do you do with all that data? And how do you, so when you have state and operator records that are the same, then certainly that effort, inspectors are actually to be able to do more of their job and inspect instead of doing book reconciliations. So that I take, also as going ahead, and I'm really curious what we will find on the chemical side. But any other comments from Sarah, Edward, or David on this?
Yeah, I just want to jump in. Oh, sorry.
Go on, David. You go first.
Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I just want to say there's also there's not a dollar value on avoiding error. Like John mentioned, we're blockchain helps a lot with avoiding the administrative tasks and ensuring things are sent and And if there is error there, it can be extremely costly to an organization. And so I think it's important for people to understand that you have your fixed costs that you're saving, but you also have savings in terms of avoidance of error.
Edward.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking back a bit to the previous question as well about implementation and why are people implementing DLT. I think the ability for long-term data storage is really important because we're offering something which cannot be done so effectively another way, in having multiple participants preserve and maintain a long-term data store, which of course comes to the fore for nuclear waste storage, where you may need to store this data for a completely unspecified amount of time. And that's something that DLT really just does. So
Yeah.
I just on your point, and then to David's point, when they talked about how do you put a dollar amount or a quantity on I call it the what if scenarios of something not happening that could have happened. And I'll go back to, if you look at supply chain counterfeit, fraudulent, suspect items, and I'll specifically talk about the counterfeit parts that are making their way through the global supply chain into a nuclear station. And if those particular parts are earmarked for the pressure boundary program or for the nuclear CANDU reactor itself, and it's a part that isn't truly counterfeit and hasn't been properly tested, and it doesn't have the right composition of materials, that could result in catastrophic events in a nuclear station. That's the what ifs. How do you quantify that? All we can say is that we've greatly reduced or mitigated risks and hope that it doesn't happen. So that was a great point, David.
Anyone else? But it is a very good point, because it's not just even about that nuclear facility. There's always a lot of talk in the nuclear sector about one event in one part of the world has an impact on the entire global sector. So that's also something that to keep in mind as well. And we have heard a lot from our engagement with a variety of different industry and government actors that the tracking of source codes is also incredibly important to that. And as you're mentioning, in terms of counterfeiting and mitigating that risk. So what are the risks, if any, to implementation? Everyone's jumping in. Anyone? I'll just open up the floor.
I'll hop in. A risk in implementation, I think one is failure. If you fail to convince your organization or you fail to implement it well, you have effectively hurt the chances of a similar technology being adopted. And that, to me, I think about a lot. I sometimes like to think of the optimistic side of things, where I say, well, if we succeed, then everyone succeeds, because everyone's going to understand how awesome this is, and we'll see other use cases, and it's gonna revolutionize the way we do work. But I also always think about the other side of things, where if we fail, or if we don't convince enough people, then we've effectively hurt other people in their quest to adopt novel technology.
I think that's a great point, actually. We see quite a lot of, well, I'm personal friends with a lot of the people who run companies like mine, because we're a relatively small community, and it's very easy to get caught up in having a kind of bidding war, especially because DLT is this kind of celebrity technology. People have programs and they have proof of concept and things. It's very easy to get caught up having a competition between us and the 5 other companies that sort of look and think like us. But actually, that's a fantastic point, because our competition is inertia and nothing. Our competition, when you're looking at budgets, our competition is IBM and Cisco, who are still trying to tell people that they will be absolutely safe if only they put this widget inside their OT and run stuff the way they did before. So I think having this idea of the rising tide raising all boats, having drinking our own Kool-Aid and having a collaborative business approach to deploying DLT type solutions, I think is a really important thing that we should do more of. And support your close competitors, because us scrabbling around in the small hundreds of millions are fighting beasts who are in the hundreds of billions, and that's the thing we have to overturn.
Well, it is I mean, a new technology, right? I mean, basically 13 years it's been around. So and actually, you know what, I'm going to jump ahead one question because this is a good lead into, where do you see DLT going in the next 5-10 years? And actually, I'm going to start with Sarah, because Sarah, China, as you mentioned, is leap years really ahead of the rest. So what are your thoughts about initiatives going forward and implementation in China?
Yeah, so I have a couple of thoughts. One kind of is tied to the risk issue, but just looking at the future, I think China looks like it's going to be using blockchain for a long time, and it views it. Even the president of China has endorsed it as an important innovation and breakthrough technology, and so it's trying to increase competition in the blockchain industry and really grow a lot of the companies. There are lots of regulations that are coming out to promote like pilot projects and increase policy support, and also guide local governments to implement blockchain more to use for public service. And China is also trying to set forth the first blockchain national standard. And so it's trying to be a leader in that regard. One caveat, so China is doing quite well in terms of blockchain, as I've talked about, but in terms of its regulations, there's always the long arm of the state. And there are regulations, the Blockchain Information Service Management Regulation specifically, that requires data stored on blockchains to be potentially opened up to the government. So there is less anonymity in China in terms of blockchain data. And I think that makes it less attractive, at least from a Western perspective. And also service providers have to register their blockchain products and so on. So there's a lot more state intervention, which is, when we think about blockchain, a lot of times we think about something that has less state intervention, and in China it's just the opposite. So that's one big red caveat that I would just flag.
Going away, so even more regulation probably in the next 5-10 years.
Definitely.
China. Yeah, and that's probably something I think we will see, across the world potentially as well. I mean, and depending on the different sectors. But what are other thoughts on the next 5-10 years ahead for the technology? A little future forecasting. Edward, do you want to take that one on?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, in some extent, it's 5-10 years is not very long. And I think the future is quite simple, is we're just going to see more and more application. It's going to become more and more normal. To some extent, it might even slightly disappear, in that you might have systems which actually are working on something like DLT, but it's not sort of shouted about so much. It just becomes the way information is stored. I mean, certainly with the move in IT security to move from this kind of boundary protection in an old-fashioned security model to assuming that bad actors might be in your system and your primary concern is protecting your data, well, DLT is going to become ubiquitous in that sort of model. I mean, more kind of focused on smaller details. So at UNSW, so University of New South Wales, Sydney, we're now working on a system to include safeguards and source licensing together in a consolidated system. So I think blockchain is also going to start bridging gaps, between these different areas where you realize, oh, this is connected to this. So you join it together using a blockchain system. I think that's, people realizing commonalities between different areas of application as well is one.
Yeah, pulling on that thread, this is one of the areas too, coming out of SLAFCO, where, a lot of the data that you need for safeguards, it's also the same data that you use for safety reporting to your regulator, and also for nuclear security purposes, whether it be operational or also, reporting up. So I think that's really where I like that point, taking it forward and seeing more interlinkages and how DLT can bridge better, let's say, at least the 3S, safety, security, and safeguards. Other thoughts on crystal ball?
Cindy, I'd love to give a few examples, and I think of the futuristic things, but they're things, we are all on the cutting edge of what we're doing from a technology perspective. And I'll give some examples of customers, projects, pilot projects that we're involved in now that really, I think, let us look in the crystal ball to say, what is 5 years going to be from now? So I'll use, for example, with OARO, we have our OARO, call it OARO Passport. And we now use the OARO blockchain to allow constituents, for example, in Mexico, to do their electoral voting. So when you think about individuals having their ID passports and having their ID passports using biometric profiling and government issue IDs, and then having their blockchain passport, this allows people to do many things. So if you think about getting on a plane and not needing any of your own credentialing information other than your face, and that solution on blockchain, and maybe doing all of your electoral voting, so there's no chances of having fraudulent voting or someone voting 55 times because you have one face, and once you vote, it's done. So I see from a crystal ball perspective that voting happening now, not only in the Western world, but maybe beyond the Western world, using blockchain as a solution and remotely. And we already know about NFTs and that business, and how, you know, the large sports teams and the galleries are using NFTs. I see that expanding greatly. They would be probably 2 or 3 examples that I would give. And also, you know, we know that purchasing tickets to get into events or sports games, that's been rolling out fast. You know, because it's the game that we're in, and the industry that we're in, we see it as table stakes, but I still think a lot of that is still futuristic for a lot of people. So I think we're on the early adoption phase, and having more global adoption, I think, is something that we'll see in the next 2 or 3 years.
Just on the ticket aspect, I was frustrated when I went to before COVID, when I went to a ball game and I couldn't leave the park because they actually said to me, "How do we know that this is your ticket once you leave?" I thought, what? I just need to go to my car.
Right.
So, you know, yeah. So that kind of thing for me, I thought, well, why is not DLT being implemented here and used? So,
we provide the Spanish Football League, soccer league in Europe. They use OARO Admit, is what we call it. And all of the ticketing is purchased on our solution on blockchain. And it just prevents any scalping from happening, from 5 people showing up for the same row of seats. And it's been an absolute delight for the customers, and welcome by the Football League.
Yes, well, it would certainly be welcome for me, you know, just when you need to do a quick pop out. In terms of, you know, why is DLT a better tool than others? David, you know, Tony had a really good slide on that when he was giving his presentation earlier, but, you know, when you were looking at CTX or looking at the problem that you had in terms of the RFQs, what was your process in going for a DLT?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually technology ambivalent when I first, you know, given our use case, our narrow use case, I said, you know, maybe this is something that we can, a data set that everyone can submit to the OPCW or submit to Interpol or submit to a third party. And I mentioned this earlier, and everyone said no. They looked at me like I had 8 heads. They're like, I don't want responsibility over that. And that ultimately was the game changer for us. We had to find a way, and I'll back up there. We offered to host it, but everyone said, we're not giving all of our information to the FBI. Like, that's crazy. And I was like, yeah, that does sound pretty crazy. I agree with you. So, you know, that was really the game changer for me, for having to understand that there are technologies out there that actually can avoid the need for the central repository of information amongst international partners where it's like a limited trust environment. So yeah, that was really the moment for me.
Yeah. John, Michelle, Edward? Sarah?
Yeah, so I think that there's always the temptation, because people think of DLT as a technology, and because it has such hype around it, there's a temptation to think that it's a thing, and that somehow, therefore, it competes with some other thing. And we've had a lot of the
I'm
early.
just finishing up a call right now. I know. I understand.
David, we can hear you.
Yeah. You sound very excited
Go
though.
ahead,
So it
John.
sounds joyful. So you know, a lot of the early failures, back, I'm talking like 2014, 2013 times, were because people thought they could just whip out the database from a regular application and plonk in a blockchain and everything would be magically wonderful. And of course it isn't. It was just a terrible database. So yeah, you've got to think in slightly different terms. But if you think that you've got these various different properties in combination, so you've got very high integrity. Oh, great, you had digital signatures a million years ago, so who cares, right? But oh, you've got universal storage. Well, you know, we've had Dropbox and cloud storage for years, so who cares? Oh, you've got federated access, and well, yeah, you've had sign-on with Facebook for years, so who cares? When you put all of those things together, that's what gives you then what David was saying, which is this mutual, it's actually, you know, horribly called mutually distrustful system that says, look, I'm perfectly satisfied that you, Mr. Vendor, or you, Mr. Regulator, are secure. No question. But you're secure for you. I don't trust that. I don't know who you hire. I don't know what you're doing. I don't know what subpoenas you're under. I don't know what you're deleting behind the scenes. So the fact that you are secure is not enough. I need to know that everything that I'm relying on from your institution is something that I can check and validate and trust and bring back into myself. And so when you get all of the properties of a DLT together, that's exactly what moves you in the IT and digital space beyond security, which frankly is simple and was solved at least 25 years ago, to trust in multi-party operations. And that's why you need it. Everything else, if you just do one of the things, databases, brilliant, they're fast, but now everybody's got all the data. Federated access, brilliant, convenient, but now everybody can log into everybody's systems and you've made a mess with your firewalls. So it's the full package implemented from the ground up that does it for you.
So where is DLT not a good fit?
It's not a good database.
It's
a terrible database.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, John. Terrible database. Edward? Oh, you're muted again.
One area where it'll really improve is when it starts to incorporate more IoT stuff. So if we can start to validate the data that goes on the blockchain, that will be a huge step forward.
So that's an example of where it certainly, particularly when we're talking about nuclear security and transport, for example, following nuclear material as it moves across borders, even within borders, that's certainly an area that would be of interest. But where does it not fit? Right? You know, you hear a lot about, and Rick had mentioned this as moderating the last session, where, CTX, what we're doing with the match project, and also what Andrea was presenting on with the customs, is that there are problems out there where this is a solution, right? Because you hear a lot about, it's a solution looking for a problem, but no, there are actual problems in terms of multi-party shared data, for example. But where is it not a good fit? Where would DLT just not be where you want to go?
So when I speak to other government agencies that are thinking about implementing blockchain, sometimes they want to do it as an internal project. And it's like, that's a solution a database could fix. That's not a solution. There isn't limited trust within your own organization. There aren't multi-parties there. You all work for the US government. I think that is, in most internal government solutions, it doesn't make a ton of sense.
Yeah. So I notice here we are getting close to the end. Thank you, by the way, for this really interesting discussion. And one of the discussions, and I think it is becoming a better one in people understanding the difference between permissioned and permissionless systems. But I wanted to, get your sense also of when is a permission system better to use than public blockchains?
Well, it's the so in our use case, Cindy, for nuclear safeguards, and I think probably for actually most things, it's the decisive feature that you need, right? It's actually what makes DLT useful, because if everything was public, I don't think there'd be much you could really do with it.
Yeah, very specifically, I mean, because we come against this all the time, and there are a lot of people who fall under various labels, but Bitcoin maximalist is the kind of the obvious shortcut, who are into utter radical transparency. And in many ways, and you can have very, nice sort of sophistry around this thing where everybody's convinced that actually being fully transparent, if you only sort of let go of your entire ego and consider the greater communal good, that this would be the correct way to be. But that's only true within a community. It's true within a group of people who are trying earnestly to work together to create a common good. But of course, there are always barbarians at the gate of that. And being transparent to them is just simply foolish. And so where you have to strike the balance on permissioning is to not go too crazy and say, well, basically, I've created a number of very, very heavy silos on my blockchain where everybody's still fully self-sovereign. You have to have some degree, as we just heard from David, you have to have some degree of accountability and shared visibility around this thing. But with nuclear safeguards, with the cybersecurity stuff that I do a lot of, with anything else here, it would be madness to publish things like vulnerabilities or counter-threat intelligence on the public web for all of the attackers and everybody else to see at the exact same moment that you take your industrial customers by surprise, who have at least 72 hours to call a shutdown and evacuate their staff and spin down their production line before they can update their equipment again. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense to have everything fully transparent to the entire world if you can help it. And that's not a security by obscurity argument or an excuse to be lazy, because you publish those vulnerabilities and that CTI to your regulator and to the authorities. But it's just a matter of common sense. Responsible disclosure is not lax public broadcast. It's getting the right information to the right people at the right time to maximize your chances of mitigating risk. And fully public systems just don't do that. And if you can do that on a fully public system, there are some prototypes of it. The weight and complexity of the crypto to achieve that is so mind-bendingly awful that you might as well not have bothered. There are things like anything where people don't know each other, public is great. As soon as you know each other and you're just trying to make an existing system better, you've got to go permissioned.
Yeah, and it's also something where, the public blockchains are really supporting cryptocurrencies, which have economic incentives for validating the data, which we certainly do not need to economically incentivize international nonproliferation treaties, right? Or at least I hope not. We don't need an atomic coin, or maybe you do, but it's not specifically for safeguards or nuclear security. So I thank you for that. And also, when we're talking back over the history even of DLT, this very short history, well, the concepts, of course, go back decades, right? But the way that they all come together is really, for me, shows how these permission systems are, they are so advanced now and light and flexible, where the public ones are lethargic. The transactions per second are really, really, really low. That in of itself for me is certainly an area. So we've got about 3 to 4 minutes left. I'd like to just end on a note where everybody gets a chance to just provide any final thoughts. And Sarah, I will start with you.
I think, blockchain is a really interesting phenomenon. And in terms of some types of use cases, we can look at China, although there's always the counterfactual of it being too much in the sight of the government. So, what too much regulation looks like. So it's interesting to see what sort of use cases are coming out, but there's always, things not to do as well.
Certainly. Edward.
Yeah, I think DLT is an exciting area to play in. There's lots to do, lots of projects that we can simply do. I'm thinking, without big funding, without asking for anyone for permission, simply do things and show people how it works. And that's partly what we're doing at UNSW Sydney.
That's great. David.
I just add that support one another. I would say that is my my biggest request and advice, I guess. There's a small but robust community here, and so I think it's very important that we support one another in each of our unique endeavors.
John.
For adoption, start with the business problem and the thing you're trying to solve, and then apply the technology to it. If you've got supply chain issues, DLT will definitely help. But start with the problem, not the technology.
And Michelle.
Build off of what John just said, but I want to, David, I am the most tenacious, optimistic person that you could probably meet, but working for a blockchain organization has been the longest sales cycle I have ever, and they say that I've shortened it in half and it's still too long. But what I always say, it's not a matter of if these solutions will be adopted, it's a when they'll be adopted. And back to Edward's point, there are buckets of gold, and I'm one person and I see so many solutions for blockchain in many industries. So again, it's being tenacious, and us supporting one another in groups like this gives me the food and the energy that I need to continue and I thrive off of. So all the points were excellent.
Great. Excuse me. Well, thank you all. This was a wonderful discussion. And I really appreciate you all taking the time. Hopefully we can do this all again in a few months' time and do an update. If not public, at least amongst each other. So thank you all for participating. And also thank you to our live audience, and all the presentations will be put online afterwards on the event page. And the videos will also be made available. So thank you again all, and take care. Have a wonderful day.